First of all, thanks everyone for coming to this meeting of Rock Around the Blockade. It's the 50th anniversary, as people may know, of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and the declaration that the Cuban Revolution was a socialist revolution. Just a couple of things to begin with, housekeeping. Can everyone make sure the phones are either off or on silent so we don't have any interruptions? And if anyone needs the toilet in the course of the meeting, they are just out there and up the stairs. You can get out the back door or the front door, whichever is easiest. Just to go through the agenda really quickly, I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we'll have a talk from our comrade Fernando Jacomino from the Union of Young Communists and a former president of the Cuban Book Institute. Then we will have a talk from Rafael Gonzales, who is a counsellor of the Cuban embassy, and then we will have a brief talk from Claridge from Rock Around the Blockade. Just to begin with, I've got a quote from one of the figures of the Cuban War of Independence from Spanish colonialism, Antonio Maceo. He wrote, "Whoever tries to conquer Cuba will gain nothing but the dust of her blood-soaked earth if he doesn't perish in the struggle first." Maceo was an important figure in Cuba's historic struggle for national liberation. I think that quote gives a good context for what we're going to be talking about today. The attack on the Bay of Pigs attack was planned barely a year after the Cuban Revolution of 1959. In ways, it was the brainchild of President Eisenhower at the time. A document that was prepared in March 1960 by the US stated that the plan was to bring about the replacement of the Castro regime with one more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the US in such a manner to avoid any appearance of US intervention. So it's quite clear what they had in mind. The plan was approved by President Kennedy when he came into office, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Just to give a quick quote from Fidel Castro. This is from a speech that he gave on the 15th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Just describing the attack, he says, "One quiet, clear dawn on April the 15th, 1961, Yankee bombers bearing Cuban insignia attacked our air bases where a few rickety old planes with barely half a dozen pilots constituted our air forces. With unparalleled cynicism, the United States representative declared in the United Nations that those planes were part of our own air force that had rebelled. In fact, it's been proved since that the first shot fired in that invasion was by a CIA operative. Of the 1,500 mercenaries who invaded, 200 were found to be ex-Batista Army combatants." The resistance of the Cuban people was inspiring. In the days following the invasion, it took 3 days to defeat the invasion. The Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces was supported by a mass mobilization of Cubans prepared with all that they had to fight with. There were even reports of local women arming themselves with baseball bats and frying pans in their local neighborhoods. This was part of the mobilization of the newly formed Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. Over the course of the 3 days, 1,000 counter-revolutionaries were taken prisoner, and in I think what is quite a telling fact, half a year later they were sent back to Miami in exchange for $50 million worth of food and medicine. This was a massive defeat for US imperialism. In the speech that I've just referred to, Fidel reflected, "Thus the history of imperialism is written without, however, the opportune and forced confession of its crimes, implying the slightest principle of reflection on its own part, or the part of its miserable accomplices. Hereon, Watergate and the alleged incidents at the Tonkin Gulf, which were the pretext for the Vietnam War, the plans to assassinate foreign leaders, the destabilization of governments by the CIA, fascist coups, the universal principle of bribing rulers and officials carried out by the Yankee monopolies, and other similar deeds, today known to the world, to world public opinion, do not mean that such practices will cease while imperialism exists." In many ways, this is how imperialism rules the world. Following the Bay of Pigs, Cuba declared socialism as the only way forward. Today, the Cuban Revolution stands strong in the face of ongoing hostilities. In recent years, imperialist-backed coups have brought down popular governments in Haiti and Honduras, but they've been unable to defeat Cuba. They were also unable to defeat Chavez in Venezuela in the attempted coup several years ago. Under socialism, Cuba opposes forces of imperialism in Latin America, but also throughout the world, particularly at the moment in Libya. Cuba is standing against the invasion, where Britain is engaged in the 46th military operation in the Middle East or North Africa since the Second World War. Most of all, Cuba stands an example of what is possible under a revolutionary socialism. While in Britain, the ruling class parties are using the capitalist crisis to attack the rights of working class people to housing, healthcare, education and other public services, Cuba is building houses, extending its excellent free health and education systems. Most of all, Cuba shows that there is an alternative. Okay, I'll move on now to our comrade from the UJC, Fernando.